and rights at risk due to the KwaZulu-Natal floods. And it was stated that over 440 lives were lost, including 57 school children. Now, to give a bit more insight into, climate change and the involvement of children in the action towards changing climate change, we have from a Department of Basic Education, Mr. Liko Botterman. And with that, I would also like to welcome everybody else on the panel. Liko, good morning.
Good morning, Mateko. Good morning to everybody who is watching us or joining us this morning. Thank you.
You can go ahead, Liko.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm joining you from the Northwest in Klerksdorp because the Department of Basic Education is busy with other parts of work that my portfolio is responsible for. So please forgive me if there is background noise. I'm sitting outside as, proceedings are continuing. But I thought there is no way that I'm missing this opportunity to have this very first public conversation about education for sustainable development and climate change, because we have been speaking with and among ourselves at DBE with our partners about what we need to do to revolutionize the work around climate change. Because in the curriculum, we have dealt with climate change issues, as adequately as we could. And I know that there have been some criticisms around the curriculum and what still needs to be adjusted and modified in the curriculum for it to respond better to climate change issues in schools. And I know for a fact, for example, there are issues that have been raised about some of the content and content gaps that still exist in terms of climate change. There has been criticisms around teacher development, that sometimes the teachers that are responsible for the delivery of climate change content in life orientation, for example, are not adequately prepared to do this. And in addition to that, they don't have teaching aids to deliver content on climate change. The third thing that has been mentioned is around learning and teaching support materials, that we needed to look at what kind of materials we can provide to children and teachers to support learning and teaching. And as such, we have now, developed life orientation textbooks that have got a whole section that is dedicated on climate change. And we hope that these textbooks would be finalized by the year 2023, so that schools can begin to use them, because there's a whole lot of stuff that is included in the life orientation textbooks. We do have a previous or precedent experience about learning and teaching support materials and teacher manuals, etc. And we've got experience of this when we look at the delivery of comprehensive sexuality education, for example, where we have provided scripted lesson plans for educators, so that no matter who you are as an educator and no matter where you are in the country, that you've got something that you can use as a script should you run out of words or out of ways of delivering climate change information and content to children according to the grades. And I think that as we go forward, this is something that will require us as the Department of Basic Education to look at in supporting curriculum, to look at what, if there are any manuals or scripted lesson plans that we can develop that are aligned to the life orientation textbooks and the CAPS document, which is the Curriculum Assessment and Policy Statement that we're using in the Department of Basic Education. So we know that our partners who have been working in the space before we as the Department of Basic Education took up the responsibility of climate change, we know that our partners have been doing work around teacher training, supporting teachers with tools and instruments to deliver this. And so we are assured that we're not starting from zero. There is work that has been undertaken by partners everywhere else who may want to make those materials available to us as an open source material so that we can chop and change it and make it relevant for what we are going to try and do to support classroom delivery of climate change. But classroom-based delivery is not the only modality for delivery of climate change knowledge. We also have the core curricular space, which for me is probably the richest space to deal with climate change, because when you deal with it in the school or in the classroom setting, it's really just about getting the concepts out and teasing out the concepts and making sure that children are exposed to these concepts. And unfortunately, there are time limitations in the classroom because each topic in the learning area can only be taught within a certain period of time in a year, and it can also be delivered within a particular hour or less than an hour in a day. So they are quite time limited and constrained time allocations in the classroom. So the core curricular space really offers an opportunity for us, an opportunity that is not time sensitive, that is not time bound, that can continue, and that allows us to use our innovation and creativity to impart knowledge about climate change among our learners and our teachers who are passionate about education for sustainable development. So we are working with our partners at the moment in civil society, in business, and other government entities who are pulling our heads together, because we realize that if we miss the opportunity of imparting climate change knowledge at a school level whilst children are at school and as a captive audience, we might just be adding to the problem of climate change. And so we want to take advantage of what the schooling setting is making available to us in terms of curriculum and co-curricular spaces, so that we impart this knowledge. And initially, many of us would have thought that climate change is a European concept, is a European problem, and it's not a problem for the Africans. But I think the recent experiences we've had about flooding and the climate that is changing now in South Africa, and the heavy rains that we're experiencing, and the drying waterlands that we have at the moment, issues around littering and recycling that is not being taken seriously. All of those things are showing that Africa is as much part of it as European countries are. And we need to do something, because we are going to lose our African continent, our rich African continent, unless we hold our hands and we support one another with the resources that we have, the skills that we have, the expertise that we have, and the materials and tools that we have to ensure that we advance this problem of, or rather our response to this problem of climate change. Whether or not we are on time, I think that remains as a matter that is debatable. But as far as I'm concerned, as Liko Botman, the person, but Liko Botman as the professional that has now been given this responsibility by the Minister of Basic Education, I think that we are far behind from where we are supposed to be in as far as response mechanisms for climate change are concerned. And so we need to catch up. And as we catch up, we need to be more efficient, effective, and economical about the responses and the mechanisms that we come up with to respond to the issues of climate change in South Africa. And we cannot do this alone. We require all partners and all stakeholders involved, and we require to share the resource bases that exist outside of the Department of Basic Education to support us in our new vision of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liko. I mean, as you speak, I remember when I was still in school, there were programs where we'd be taught about, the water shortage, and, there were very many activities that were done to ensure that, and I wonder, where the gap was missed in this instance, or when, the department stopped doing such initiatives. But I guess we'll hear more about that from Cindy Lee, who will give us, guidance on how to develop campaigns and communication strategies on climate change. And Cindy Lee is from WESA, the Wildlife and Environment Society of South Africa. Cindy, welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Tsepo. Can you see my screen?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thanks, Liko. That was a great introduction to children's voices, within the climate change space. And we all know that, learning really starts in the schooling journey. So whether we learn about math, science, languages, climate change is an important, what we call subject matter that should be included in all of our learning areas throughout school. It's great to see that the department is really taking the lead in terms of embedding climate change as a specific module within the life sciences subject area. And it would be great to see it also develop into the other learning areas, because there's so much to learn from mathematics if you speak about climate change. So what I wanted to do today is really also bring the children's voices into this webinar. So one of the things that I think that us as, government, civil society, business can do a little bit better is to have conversations with children when we speak about children. And so the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months, we've really started to look at how do children's voices actually end up at the COPs that continue to be had every single year. There's one campaign that was started by an organization that WESA is an affiliate of, called the Foundation for Environmental Education. And they really speak about, this notion of us running out of time if we actually don't address the climate crisis. I think that's what we need to start calling it, because it's not about climate just changing anymore, but that change has actually caused the crisis. And some people refer to it as the most existential crisis that humanity has faced. So I want to start off by bringing the children's voices into this space by sharing this video. And please just let me know if you can hear the sound.
On behalf of millions of South Africa and world youth, we are here today to voice out our concerns about climate change.
Climate education is a critical cornerstone to empower youth to build climate-resilient communities. We want climate education as part of our schools' learning journeys. We, learners in schools across South Africa, urge leaders to employ an inclusive approach for youth involvement in decision-making processes. We encourage young people across the globe to be change makers in society and advocate against environmental injustice, combat pollution, and promote sustainable living.
You have been telling us number of times of the dangers of allowing planets to warm, but there is no action from your side.
Imfundo ngemozulu yenye yeentsika zokuxhobisa ulutsha ukuze lwakhe uluntu olukwaziyo ukumelana nemozulu. Sifuna imfundo yemozulu njengenxalenye yohambo lokufunda lwesikolo sethu. Thina bafundi ezikolweni kuMzantsi Afrika uphela sibongoza iinkokheli ukuba zisebenzise inkqubo ebandakanya bonke abafundi ekuthatheni inxaxheba kolutsha kwenkqubo zokwenziwa kwezigqibo. Sikhuthaza abantu abatsha kwihlabathi jikelele ukuba babe ngabenzi botshintsho kuluntu kwaye bakhuthaze ukungabikho kobulungisa kokusingqongileyo. Balwe nongcoliseko kwaye bakhuthaze ukuphila okuzinzileyo.
Climate change is a problem that is here, and now as the youth we feel the impacts.
Klimaatsopvoeding is een van die hoekstene vir die bemagtiging van die jeug om klimaatsbestandige gemeenskappe te bou. Ons wil klimaatsopvoeding hê as deel van ons skoolloopbane. Ons, leerders in skole regoor Suid-Afrika, doen 'n beroep op leiers om 'n inklusiewe benadering vir jeugbetrokkenheid by besluitnemingsprosesse te gebruik. Ons moedig jong mense regoor die wêreld aan om veranderingsmakers in die samelewing te wees en teen omgewingsonregtighede te pleit, besoedeling te bestry en 'n volhoubare lewe te bevorder.
Everyone needs to play their part. Therefore, don't shout at the youth.
So this is one of our communications campaigns that we started with some of the schools across South Africa. We work with about over 700 schools every year to bring the messages of climate change into the classrooms and also outside of their classrooms. So a lot of our work is around working with teachers, learners, and the school leadership teams to be able to create this enabling environment to include climate education into children's everyday lives. So this is the message, this is the collective message that schools, over 2,500 learners put together to send to COP27 with one of our WESA representatives that's actually at COP27 now. It's a clear message that they want climate education as one of the cornerstones of their education journey in their lives, but because everybody keeps saying that the future generations are going to be impacted the most, and nobody is inviting them to the table to actually say, how do we make your future a more sustainable, a more just, and a more livable one? So maximizing voice through campaigning is something that's really, really prone in South Africa, and it's something that we should use. The running out of time campaigns basically like started at COP27 in Scotland, where COP27 was held in Scotland. And people ran, swam, cycled, boated all the way from Scotland through to Egypt to deliver this climate education message that specifically is focused on youth across the world. So in South Africa, WESA organized what we call the relay race, and we included all provinces to be part of creating messages, handing it over, all student-led, creating their messages, handing it over to their principals, and their principals then handed it over to WESA to create a collective South African youth voice to be taken, first of all to Barbara Creasy, and then second of all through to COP27 in Egypt. So that's kind of like, you know, some of the ways that we can maximize youth voices. But at the same time, this is a European campaign that was started, and some of the questions that teachers and learners and principals asked us is like, why is it so late in the year? You know, why is it when we are starting to prepare for exams? So the kind of like way that we need to like look at voice and campaigning in South Africa should be a South African approach. And this is where WESA really is coming to like look at how do we take the resources that are out there and really look at Africanizing and South Africanizing it so that it can work for our schools, our teachers, our learners. COP27 started, I think, a week or so ago. And the focus at this year's COP27 is really looking at how do we actually like focus on the Paris Agreement that was signed by most of the countries across the world. And that is really to like keep the warming to well below 2 degrees. Now, a lot of scientists are basically saying that we've gone past the point of 2 degrees. And actually in some places in South Africa, if you look at the hotter places or the hotter provinces, let's take, for example, the Northern Cape, it's predicted that the warming will actually rise to 7 degrees by 2050. So the 2 degrees that the world is speaking about has a completely different meaning for South Africa and Africa. And how do we actually like build ability for our future generations to be able to like cope with those kind of like changes and to be able to like create a sense of climate, what we call climate resilience, but really it's about adaptation. How do we bring them into the foreground to be able to like make decisions about the impacts that climate change will definitely have on their futures? And if I look at COP27, if I look at all of these different kind of like conversations that I had about climate change, who really makes the decisions, you know? Who are at the head of the table, sitting there making the decisions and saying, these are the things that we need to do? Who drafted the Sustainable Development Goals, as an example? Who drafted the Paris Agreement? And this is in direct contrast when we look at the climate issue being a child rights crisis. So everybody keeps saying that the effects of climate change is here, will intensify, and the people that will suffer the most are children, but they are never at the table when we need to like speak about what are the kind of things that we need to do to address, adapt, mitigate the impact of climate change. So there's a new wave of education, and this kind of like campaigning, messaging, protesting is really at the heart of what is driving the youth climate action movement at the moment. You know, these are all pictures taken from across South Africa. And if we are going to like completely immerse ourselves into the true meaning of what it means to campaign, what it means to actually fight for ourselves, our communities, and the ecosystems that we survive in, we have to take a different approach to education. We have to like look at how do we bring children's voices, youth voices into spaces that does not link to tokenism? How do we actually engage with them in a meaningful way where they feel that their voices are heard? So for us at WESA, when we look at campaigning, when we look at messaging, when we look at what do we actually need to like incorporate in learning journeys of children, it's really about two things for me. Our education, particularly with a decolonizing lens, should look at advocacy and action. Those are the things that really will matter for youth as they transition into this just world, into a sustainable world. But how do we get them there? And our education need to do two things for them. Apart from the life skills, apart from the competencies in terms of like proving that they are worthy to like move to the next phase of their learning journey, how do we enable them to advocate for a healthy and a sustainable planet? How do we enable them to like act, and what are the things that they can do in their schools and in the communities to work towards that healthy and that sustainable planet? So just quickly about WESA, this is something that we've been doing for years, since 1926, and we really now at the heart of the work that we do is that we want to create a movement of people caring for themselves and therefore caring for the earth. And how we do that is through citizen action, messaging, campaigning. How do we get our voices across to the decision makers in our communities, as far up as the decision makers of our leaders in this country? And then how do we create this notion of like advocating and acting for environmental and social justice through our actions, through our education systems, through the partnerships that we create, and obviously to like then move towards a future that is more sustainable, a future that is more inhabitable. You know, if we look at all of the science now, it's very, very doom and gloom. So these are the kind of things that WESA focuses on in schools, looking at the climate emergency, how teachers, how learners can be a part of a movement to address that locally for them, and then moving out to the rest of the country. How do we create and protect our spaces so that we can protect the diversity that makes South Africa so unique, both from a people point of view and from a nature point of view? And then how do we tackle pollution as one of the biggest environmental and social challenges in this country? How do we create a sense of urgency around creating clean spaces, whether it's our water spaces, whether it's our community spaces? You know, how do we create this culture of pride and care for the spaces that we are in? And some of the WESA programs really driving these kind of like actions, we call them our points of impact, is really focusing on youth and teachers to be able to like enable them, because at WESA we really see teachers as multipliers of knowledge, multipliers of action, and they can really become guides, role models for students, for learners in classroom and outside of the classroom to be able to like take action. I'm not going to run through all of these, but these are some of the work that WESA is currently doing to be able to like bring action at grassroots level that can be scaled up, duplicated in other parts of the country, and really make a difference on the ground. So I just wanted to read a statement that was made now at COP27, speaking about climate change education, and it says, You know, a global survey revealed that only 53 countries in the world have climate change education as part of their national school curriculum, and that 70% of the learners can't explain climate change or how it affects them. So part of the problem is that global school education is done through passive transfer of knowledge. Rather, education needs to be adaptive and active and use active methods to generate advocacy and agency. You know, so we always come back to this advocacy and agency, and that's really how voice is amplified. So for me, and just to finish off, climate change and climate education in South Africa has really gotten a lot of structures in place. The Department of Education and their partners have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of like laying the foundations and policies to enable climate education in South African schools. Just recently, the Education for Sustainable Development in Southern African Countries framework was launched, where all of the SADC countries basically agreed to embed ESD into the education journeys of their school children. The two things that I would like to add for climate change education in South Africa to really be effective is looking at how do we promote agency and empathy in the learning journeys, especially through climate education. How do we wash away these footprints of fear and create spaces for handprints of hope? And that is how can people, learners particularly, get involved, get their hands dirty, get their hearts, get their minds involved in climate education. The other part of it is really looking at justice as the focus, environmental justice, social justice, economic justice, as the focus for climate education and inclusion. Nobody needs to be left behind. We cannot afford to leave people behind in this journey of climate education in South Africa. Climate education needs to be a lifelong learning journey from children in ECD all the way up to our grandparents. How do we include them to protect these ecosystems that we are a part of and heavily rely on? And with that, I think I've taken more than enough time, Chair, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think with what you have shared, I think it takes a nice segue to you know, the insight into why it's important for the younger generation to be at the forefront of climate change. And with that, we'll have the National Youth Climate Action Plan lead, Ms. Celiwe Shivambu. I'm sure from what Cindy Lee has spoken about, there's a lot more you can offer in terms of, you know, tangible action.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for having me in today's session. And thank you for the previous speakers. They've laid such an important solid ground that I'm able to then come in and say, this is the practical work that we have done as young people in this country. So I'm just going to quickly start on the role young people have played in the creation of South Africa's very first Youth Climate Action Plan. And I was project lead for that. And when we came about with the Youth Climate Action Plan, it was just shortly after the city of Joburg had launched their climate action plan for the city of Joburg. And as young people at Youth at SAYA, who are part of the youth committee policy, a youth program at SAYA that tries to get young people engaged in policy work. And in the process, we then asked for the city of Joburg if we can be part of the consultation process. And that's all we wanted when the city was coming up with their climate action plan, was just to consult and comment on it. But the city then saw the importance of having young people as an important stakeholder in the city's climate action plan. And they gave us a chapter, and that's in the Joburg ICAP. Those that are interested, it's chapter 6 under mobilizing stakeholders. And this chapter is very much important because we had two solid questions when we started with this process. And it was, what is the city of Joburg do young people envision, right? And what is the city that they dream of? And through that, we had a series of young people who stayed in the city of Joburg, sending in comments and sending in some of their stories to basically highlight the city of Joburg that they would like to stay in. And from then, we then formed the Johannesburg YCAP, which had its 7 principles. And under those principles, we spoke about intersectionality, we spoke about advocacy, we spoke about sustainable environment. And it was basically this policy where young people got to be part of something, where young people got to write policy. And from there, we then wanted every young person in South Africa to get involved in this. And this is when we saw young people from all over South Africa, from, representing various organizations, schools, university groups, communities, to then come together and help develop, the SA YCAP. And our goal with the YCAP, it was to create a framework that was going to inspire youth-led action, and also, further serve as a guide for, youth, decision makers, civil society, businesses, and academia, and all other stakeholders in trying to reshape our country into a climate just and a resilient society. And this SA YCAP is what also helped us when we were drafting South African Youth COP statement to COP, and of which WESA was also a part of it. And in these hubs that we created all over Joburg, again, it was a series of having young people dream about what they would like actually envision what they would like to be in the COP27 agenda, what they would like the South African delegates that are going to COP to discuss there, or to basically try and push the agenda that young people wanted on the table. And a series of those were mentioned in the COP statement that was submitted to the Department of Environment, Fisheries, and also to the Presidential Climate Commission. And this really comes after when young people have, seen the effects of climate change, just like, Cindy and Mr. Liko have explained. And this comes after, the KZN floods, the droughts that have been happening. And young people then saw that for South Africa, it's no longer just to mitigate, but it's to try and adapt, the climate crisis and build resilience. And that required that we do not have a solution that is a one size fits all, because South Africa is just a special country. If we were to face if we're facing any climate crisis, we will have floods and drought in a span of 2 years or the same year. So young people coming from different parts of South Africa had then wanted to shape some of the ideas and some of the implement, adaptation and mitigation strategies that the South African government and also their local government could try and implement. And in all, for the first time in this country, we saw young people being active participants in the policy space. We saw young people's lived experiences and their stories of why, one, they wanted to join the climate movement, and two, why they're fighting for climate change. We saw those stories being translated into policy, and which is why with the SA YCAP, we have translated into 5 South African languages, because we wanted it to be accessible. We speak about the accessibility of the policy. And since then, young people have had to quote their own very action plan when speaking in instances of climate change. But I think what I would like to really touch on today that is very important is one of our pillars at the SA with the SA YCAP, and that is advocacy and activism. And within this pillar, we then speak of advocacy and communication, we speak on awareness raising, and we speak on the importance of community and civil society, education, and the media as well. And this is because advocacy then plays a significant role in shaping South Africa's socio-economic landscape. And it is important, to have representation from all sectors of people. As I've mentioned, that South Africa is just vast and very different and a very special country. And it's very important that in whatever work we do, it reflects the people of South Africa. And the SA YCAP stresses that advocacy should be encouraged in educational institutions, and that youth should be educated and capacitated with the skills and resources to become active agents of change within their communities. And improving digital literacy was also one of the the skills that we identified, and reducing the digital divide is going to be very key in achieving this. Youth also need to be included in all stages of policy development and within decision-making spaces. And I think this time around, South Africa, I just recently came back from COP27 in Egypt, and I went there as a project lead of the SA YCAP and also with the Presidential Climate Commission. And I think it was a good time to be South African at that COP, because we saw so many young people that were representing NGO, civil society, in South Africa, funded by South African institutions that were at COP. And as young people, that's something that has never happened before. But we saw young people having access to party badges. We saw young people having access to NGOs, observer badges. And all in all, that basically showed that we had young people in all these spaces, and with this much access at COP. And is there room for more people to come, for more young people to come in at COP28? Definitely. But right now, it's very important that I really highlight that we saw some of that representativity. We saw young people. I personally saw young people that, that I've met in South Africa and that have been activists for the longest time, being at COP and representing their constituency. And a very also important, point in this is the role of communities and civil societies that they can play, because it is very important to ensure that climate action reflects the needs of the people that are impacted most by it, and that this is supported by policy and research as well. Youth play a crucial role in uniting different sectors of society. And in the SA YCAP, again, we advocate for the capacitation of community-based organizations, calling for intergenerational dialogues and the engagement with indigenous communities. And also the inclusion of, vulnerable and marginalized groups in policy development, including youth and children. Just also to just wrap up, the importance of education in the SA YCAP is also heavily highlighted, because we believe that it's very fundamental in tackling the climate crisis, and innovative and collaborative models of teaching need to be adopted, as Mr. Liko has, brilliantly explained earlier. And that and part of that includes, developing a national climate change curriculum, establishing climate change education programs, such as what WESA is doing, and integrating, contributions from indigenous people, and capacitating teachers as well, and integrate green skills and training into vocational colleges as well, knowing that in the just transition of in South Africa, a lot of jobs will be non-existent, and a lot of jobs will have to be green, will need more green skills. And then how do our universities and our colleges have those skills readily for the just transition in South Africa? Because that doesn't really happen in a lot of mining communities or with coal miners, but the just transition will affect a lot of jobs, especially in a country where unemployment can be based on a lot of factors, such as lack of skills, and so forth and so forth. We do believe that it is important that green skills are integrated into the training and in vocational colleges and universities. And I think just to sum up, I think it's very much important that we speak about the role of media, especially because a lot of children and youth are, using social media, whether that's your traditional or digital social media. It is very much important that media plays a role that could influence society and shape narratives, and shape narratives into the danger of, climate change, or even the role young people are playing in climate change. Because I think even right now, just, with, the COP hype, you see that how COP is reported, or the impacts of the work being done there, it's reported at a very high level. You're reporting where it's just governments speaking to other governments and international institutions speaking to each other, and there's not really anyone speaking to the community or speaking to young people about what's happening at COP. And I mean, as young people that we were at COP, we tried our honest best to quickly get on an Instagram live, quickly, do a tweet just to keep young people engaged. But we really do need the media to help us in driving this narrative that young people are at work and young people are an important stakeholder in climate action. And they can use storytelling to show the impacts of climate change. And I mean, we as young people, we really, readily to help, media houses in, such training workshops. And throughout the SAYCAP, if anyone, would like to, have a look at it, you can go through saycap.org. And in the action plan on its own, you see that we write on our pillars, and straight after a pillar, we have a story. And these stories are there because these are the stories young people wrote to us as the project lead and say, hey, this is what's happening in my community. I want to be a climate activist because I'm fighting with the cows in the morning when I have to collect fresh water. It's about who got to the river first and who's going to have fresh water. And that story alone just translated into policy by saying to local government or the national government that we need clean water, and sanitation is very much important. And it's such stories that young people wrote to us, that we wanted to put them out there. We didn't want to hide them. We wanted to put them out there. So if you do have the time, please go have a look at those stories, read what young people in high school and universities, young people that are outside of school, young people that are part of organizations like Youth at SAYA and WESA are saying about climate change in their own story, telling their own story, and also have a look at what we have done to try and translate all of those stories into policy. We do continuously hope that the SAYCAP will continue to be a living document. We spoke at length about it at COP, but we still want more young people to come in with their stories. We still want young people to engage with the SAYCAP and hopefully start working on the implementation work of the SAYCAP so that we can ensure that young people are at the forefront, because the SAYCAP was written by young South Africans for young South Africans by young South Africans together. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Celiwe. And as you're speaking, before we get into the question and answer session, I have my own question to all the panelists. Where do you think that the gaps are? Where is everyone missing each other in terms of just getting a more cohesive and a coherent way of working and understanding, climate change? Because I think, as Celiwe reflected, the language is very much high level, and the way in which the climate change gets spoken about, it's very much an other people issue. And then when you talk about it, when you discover it, it will be from a WESA or, from an SAYCAP, but there just doesn't seem to be a cohesive way of working around it. And I guess I'm just asking that we can have a reflection on that. Thank you, Celiwe, for that. And with that, I'm now opening the answer and question session, and we can have a conversation, amongst us, the panelists and everyone in the room. Celiwe.
Thank you for that question. I think, and I've, as young people, we've been thinking a lot about this. I think in the climate space, there's a lot of activism, right? So activism looks different. And as young people, we have tried our honest best to ensure that the whatever gap is between us, that we close it. And how do we close that is by identifying that everyone's role in the climate movement is important. So the South African delegates that are negotiating at COP, their role is important. But another role that's equally important is the young people that are protesting outside COP right now. It's also important. Another role that's very much important is the young people or civil society organizations that are there as watchdogs and observers. So everyone's role in the climate movement needs to be seen as important. And when I, for one, started getting involved in the climate space, it's because it was a very wide space and it did not allow for Black women. And how Black women were spoken about in this space was that we were grouped together with children. So it was women and children, and we were seen as this vulnerable people. And it was like, no, women have been agents of change in South Africa. And I speak at length about this on my thesis paper when I was speaking about gender mainstreaming climate policies, to see if climate policies are feminist enough, right? And the reason for that is because everyone's role in the climate space needs to be seen and given the space to be important. And I might not be saying this well, but I feel like it's very important that as we go out of this today's session, and we, most of us work with young people in the space, is that we reiterate this message to young people that your role in the space is important, your activism is important. This is why we've involved young people sending in their arts and pictures and drawings and saying, oh, this is my voice. This is what I'm contributing to the SAYCAP, and young people writing poetry, and young people doing dances and plays, and young people being involved in policy spaces, and young people being radical and being at the forefront of marches and doing Fridays for the Future. And that on its own says to young people that whatever skill set you have and you bring to the movement, it is appreciated and it is important. And I think that's a very important message that we need to encourage young people. And that's the best way they can get involved, is by seeing that whatever skill set they have, whatever talents they have, they are needed and they are very much important in the space. And I think that will allow for collaboration. And obviously the adults and the big institutions and whatever can see what young people are doing and try and copy that.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add from my side also, very well said in terms of voices that are important. I think the accessibility of climate information is definitely a gap. In terms of different languages, in terms of different formats, I've continuously spoke about people with disabilities being excluded from the climate dialogues, the climate discussions, and that's changing over time. The only thing, I think the gap, if you speak about a gap, I feel like it's time, and I feel like we're running out of it. The urgency of it, climate change has always been seen as a psychologically distant problem. So it's so big and so complex that most of us, for the most part, don't understand the science when people speak about it. So I think public participation processes need to be a lot more inclusive in terms of language, in terms of cultures, in terms of gender. If we look at having a discussion around how your community is affected by the things that are currently happening within the space. And then the question that we need to ask is, how far is too far when we look at addressing the climate crisis? Should we start burning down companies that actively contribute towards the impacts and the acceleration of climate change? what are the kind of like passive things that we need to do? So those are also the kind of conversations that we need to have, because the environmental movement have been through various stages of intensity. And for the longest time, all of these things seems like it's not moving the pendulum to the other side. So we also need to start asking ourselves, how far is too far for us and for young people, for policymakers to actually push to say, this is up to here and no further or no more. And then I think the other thing that we need to realize is capitalism also plays a big part of the climate crisis, the kind of like way we are thinking about things and solutions, and how do we actually address that? So in terms of like gaps, how do we bring them into the conversation to like create a system that does not exist already, but can be innovatively thought about? And then the other thing I wanted to say is like, how do we start looking at innovation? You know, this notion to like continuously innovate, create, develop. How do we innovate the space to make sure that we actually can live a sustainable life? So that's something also for us to start thinking about.
Thank you so much. We have a question directed to you, Liko, from Carlo. Says, good day, I'm Carlo, honored to be part of this webinar. Is it possible for Mr. Botterman to give an example of the core curricular spaces and where it has been initiated for better understanding? Just to also say that to everyone in the webinar, you can raise your hand and pose the question. Liko? Liko, are you able to hear the question to you? Can everyone hear me? It might be me having the problem.
Can hear you, Chair.
Oh, thank you. Liko? Okay, the other question from Carlo that we have, I think it's directed to you, Cindy Lee. They'd like to know, how does South Africa have an official representative that is part of the Young NGO, the youth constituency at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? Carlo, are you here? Are you able to pose that question, perhaps in a better manner than I did? Carlo? Unless Cindy, you were, yes, Carlo, go ahead. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I think you posed it well. I just want to ask Cindy Lee, because I totally agree with what she said, and I agree with the movement of WESA. And I just want to ask her, because we have Yango, which is like the constituency, the youth constituency at the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change. And she mentioned that there is a representative, and I think Ms. Salewe also mentioned the same, that there is a representative at the COP27. And I wanted to ask if we do have some form official representative that's part of the Yango.
We do. Actually, Yango organizes a few different events before each COP each year. And they actually had one of their regional conferences of youth in Pretoria this year as they were getting ready to go to COP27. Kaliwa also mentioned that there's lots of like young representatives at COP27 this year from South African youth movements, climate youth movements. So there's definitely been an improvement in terms of like participation of youth in these big dialogues and in these big discussions. And I think really where the next step would be for us to be able to like look at how do we get young people into spaces where the decisions are actually being made and mandated and framed. So yes, there's definitely Yango from around the world are represented at COP, including South Africa. Thanks, Carlo.
Awesome, awesome, guys. May I ask another question?
Sure, go ahead.
While I'm on, I'm just
Your time.
Yeah. So as you mentioned that we did have a regional conference in South Africa, yeah, I just wanted to touch on that and ask how does that take place and how does the participation work, and you know, the selection of the representatives that takes part in those type of conferences. Do we have a body, a council in South Africa that's based in you know, that has reps from different provinces, or how does the structure work in Southern Africa? That's actually my question in a nutshell. How does the structure work? Do we have a council or a body that forms part of the regional conferences that was held in South Africa this year?
Yeah, and Teliwe can help me with this. I do think there is a structure. So obviously there's like Yango International, and then they've got the different affiliates across the country. The one that was organized in, I think it was October this year in Pretoria, was led by Shamila, and I can't remember, Shamila Reed, and I can't remember the actual organization that she represented. So it's here in the back of my mind. But Carlo, in terms of like participation, they do send out through the networks widely. The regional COI that was held here was an African COI, so youth representatives from across Africa gathered in Pretoria in October to get their messaging, to get their agendas ready for COP27. So I'm not entirely sure how the message is spread to young people, but they definitely go through their networks, affiliates, and the organizations and the youth that are part of Yango. Sorry that you didn't get an invitation.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly why I'm asking the question. You know, how does the networks, what's the setup in terms of the networks, and how does communication?
You can register as a Yango representative. So you can go to their website and you can act. There's a space where you can fill in your details, and you can become an active part or an active member of the network. And if you can just Google Yango, I'm pretty sure it will come up.
Yeah, I have been on their website and I have taken a look at yeah, what it's all about, and that's why I'm asking. You spoke on it, and I think Mr. Lewe spoke on it in terms of the movement in South Africa and the dynamics and all of those things. And I just wanted to know, you know, what type of foundation is set up in South Africa thus far, and if there is an active participation body that's currently at work, because WESA is doing work, and then I think then what is it? Let me just make sure I get it right. The National Youth Climate Action Plan is doing work. So I'm just thinking, you know, is there an official body that represents South Africa at these COP conferences that takes part every year? Because that's important, I think. And actually that ties into my next question that I actually have, Ms. Cindy, and I think you touched on it. In terms of what are we supposed to do on the ground level? What are all of us you know, that's taking part in this climate change, this fight for the climate change? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to burn down buildings, or are we supposed to continue working with COP? So I'm trying to figure out what's the best strategy or the best approach of handling this entire climate change situation, because we are working with COP at the moment, and are we actually seeing any tangible progress, right? Because you mentioned in your presentation that the goal is to get below 2 degrees in the next couple of years, and that's why I'm asking, as you indicated, are we supposed to burn down buildings? Are we supposed to have dialogue with capitalists, or are we supposed to continue to work with the COP, or are we supposed to focus on all those 3 institutions as a whole? So that's actually my question.
Yeah, I'm going to like give a quick answer and then also give to Teliwe to also respond. My I think my request from you is to continue with local grassroots action, community-based action, becoming part of different networks, supporting each other. Teliwe spoke about how each and every action is an important one, and it plugs into the bigger response to climate change. But my specific kind of like guidance is always like, how can you make things happen at a local grassroots level, and then change from the bottom up. So that would be my response to you, is to like never get tired of being a part of this movement, because it is hard work. It is emotionally draining, and how do you continuously like motivate yourself is through joining the networks and continuously doing local grassroots work that can fight climate change. And I'll give over to Teliwe to also come in.
Thank you so much. So I think, again, I really do agree with Cindy. If we had an answer on what to do, when it comes to climate action, there won't be a need for like COP or COI, and some people have even said there's no need for COP. It's just a gathering of everyone, and it has little to no impact, right? But again, I think I will reiterate what Cindy said on playing your part in your community. My high school principal, and to this day, I think I live by those words, is that you brighten the corner where you are. And sometimes it doesn't look like you're doing enough if it's not on a global stage, or there's not like you're not surrounded by like all these heads of states or whatever, or you feel like your activism is not important or is not seen. In the corners where we are, and we've all started doing the work and getting involved in your grassroots organization, or gathered other young people in your community and you did an activity. And for young people, I always say that the easiest way to share your skill set, because young people have a lot of skills and sometimes they don't know where to direct them, and that goes for a lot of people. I always encourage that you join your youth club. If you have a youth club in your community, you join. When I was in primary school, we had Soul Buddies. You join that, and you always find your community. It's very important that as a young person, as a young activist, that you find your community, because your community validates everything that you're feeling. And even when we were at COP, as young people who were there with my very own community, we felt like, oh my gosh, what is our role? Are we even doing enough? Is this important? Are we doing good work? And having people around you that know how much it took to draft up the SAYCAP, the number of nights that we had to stay up. I mean, we worked through the SAYCAP is done by university students, high school students, and you can only imagine how those timetables just clash. And sometimes we'll have to have meetings like late at nights just to try and accommodate everyone. So I think it's very important that we find our community and we find people that are going to help us along the way, because I think it's a long way where we're going. There's still going to be COP next year. There's still going to be COI, and we right now are trying to make sure that we get as many young people in the negotiation table, as many young people with the pink party badges in at COP. But we mustn't forget the work that still needs to be done in our community. I'll speak just quickly on adaptation and resilience in South Africa's just transition. It is very much important that we understand that expertise, community members' expertise, to try and help their local government into developing that plan. And therefore, young people therefore local communities should be part of that. If your city, wherever you are, doesn't have a climate action plan, I think that could be the first step, is to say, okay, we are going to have, natural disasters or this and this. What is your plan? What is your disaster management plan? Because you can only imagine what could have happened if people in eThekwini or Durban went to the city of Thekwini and said, what is the climate action plan? What is the disaster risk plan? Those are the questions we should be asking at local levels to put pressure on local government to start thinking on ways to build resilience, make sure our communities are resilient in cases of disasters, and make sure that communities can adapt. If you can put pressure there, I think there's, I think that's where the good work can start. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
And I think I just want to add one more thing, is that I think it's important for us to realize the power that we have as citizens of this country, in terms of like which policies we want to enacted, what are the kind of like priorities for our communities that we want to like foreground. So I think as the movement grows and as more of a spotlight gets shown on the climate movement within South Africa, I think we'll get to a point where we realize the power that each individual South African citizen have through our constitution. So that's something that I'm also hoping will start to increase, and for people to be able to like hold decision makers, whether it's your ward councillor in your community, accountable for the things that are happening in your community. Thank you.
Awesome, guys. Before one final question before I get there, I just want to say that I totally agree with both of you, and I like what I hear. So just for my final question that I have on my side, guys, I just wanted to touch on the whole COVID era, or the past couple of years. What impact did that have on climate change? What were the pros and cons of the whole COVID thing?
I don't know who wants to take on that question, and that will be the final question that we have, and we have to move towards closing the session. I don't know if Cindy or Qilwe will take it, and then we will move to close the question and answer session.
I can try. I'm definitely not a specialist in terms of like COVID environmental relations, but something that was quite concerning for me that came out of COVID, there was a lot of like videos that went viral in terms of like how nature was regenerating itself, because there were no human influence or human activities on specific, especially like within the tourism industry. And I thought it was like a very eco-fascist point of view. We also needed to look at where those messages are coming from, because we need to realize that us as human beings are a part of nature. We cannot completely disappear, and then nature will kind of like regenerate itself and come back. So the thing that I learned from COVID, and the lesson that I continuously take from these kind of like crises that are brought upon us, is how do we actually then use that as a teachable point or a teachable moment in the kind of like history of humanity. So how do we take the lessons from, for example, everybody not going to a specific area, and then that ecosystem regenerating itself? What are the kind of like new strategies that we can put in place for that to still happen with human presence, So there's a lot of like things floating out there in terms of like how COVID helped the environment, and I sometimes wonder, like where does that messaging come from, or what is the intention of that messaging? A lot of overpopulation discussions were had during COVID, and I'm quite cautious when it comes to those kind of things, because on the continent, there is a lot of space, and how do we move between these kind of like hubs of concentration to actually like move between sustainability patterns. So I hope that answers your question, Carlo. I didn't completely answer it, but at the same time, it's a very difficult question to answer. It's a question that needs engaging, but at the same time, I feel like that we shouldn't look at what was crafted during COVID as the solution, because we cannot remove human beings from the planet. I mean, we can, and what will happen then? Or so it's important for us to not have those kind of like eco-fascist approaches when it comes to sustainability, because now we are in the conversation of having a just transition, and what does that look like for each country, and how do we include our communities as part of the ecosystems that they live in, and not something as separate.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carlo. Thank you, Sindile. I always enjoy the question and answer session because it always gets everyone fired up. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the panelists for giving a riveting conversation, and just painting a very it's not a very wonderful picture, but I think there's always hope, right? Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Sindile. Thank you to Celiwe. And I'm going to hand over to Liko. Liko, I see your hand. I'm going to hand over to you, and this for me will be the last time you see my face. And right after Liko, we'll have Utsile. Nkadimeng, Utsile, I think you're in the room, and Utsile will be the last person after Liko. So Liko, you speak, and then you will hand over to Utsile. And for me, this is goodbye, and thank you everyone for just like a wonderful, riveting conversation, and incredibly insightful on what can be done, for children's voices in the climate action change. Liko, over to you.
Okay, because I'm outside now, my lighting keeps changing. So my apologies that now my face appears dark where I'm sitting. It just means that I need to change direction. I just wanted to piggyback on what Cindy was saying in response, and I think it's a very important matter. And it's probably going to be something that we, as the partners involved, I personally believe that unless we agree on a very concerted effort of advocacy, we're not going to be able to address this issue of climate change. We do need to maybe have some kind of directed efforts towards educating our communities, because doing this as a school-based activity only communities, because for me, I think climate change is not a technical conversation, but it is a livelihood and a lifestyle conversation. And like HIV infection, like COVID that we had, we'll probably need to have similar approaches of, educating communities about climate change response as a lifestyle, not as a technical subject area or subject matter. Otherwise, we'll forever be hitting, on deaf ears, because people don't understand what we mean by climate change. It took me a long while myself as a professional who work in the space to understand what climate change is. And I think it's a very important point that Cindy has made there, that we need to find ways of investing in so that we're able to make impactful change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liko, making impactful change. Utsile, you are in the room and you are our last person. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, because I am so sorry I'm joining at the tail end of this event. I just come straight from an exam. I just want to say that from what I've heard so far, I've heard really, really great responses And I just want to speak a little bit about what I heard around climate education, because I think that what's important now more than ever is that, I'm not sure if this discussion has been had, but that youth be capacitated to be the ones in their communities to engage people, to engage their parents, to engage the adults, to engage everyone they can in their community about climate. I helped co-found an organization called the Sundial Movement, which is essentially a network of high schools that capacitates young people to take action on climate. We do this by following our 3-step mantra, which is conscientize, organize, mobilize. We want to conscientize my generation that are still in high school, that are currently writing exams right now, to be the ones in their communities, with their families, with their parents, with their friends, to start the dialogue around climate and to actually help people find solutions that are practical to their communities around sustainability. Because we think that if we get that level of engagement, that valuable engagement on that level, if we can get the discussion driven there by youth, because youth need to be the ones that drive these discussions, that drive the solutions, the policies, the legislative processes, and in private sector, I think that's how we get to the climate resilient future. That's how we get the just transition done. I understand that we're running out of time. So in closing, allow me to say that, the way we achieve this is by opening up spaces. So spaces like these, I'm not sure if this has been said before, but spaces like these need to be opened up and made more accessible to young people, the youth my age that are still in high school. Because having it at 11 o'clock is, I don't know a high schooler who is able to attend outside of normal school time, outside of normal exam writing time, hence why I'm catching the tail end of this. And so the discussions we need to have around our accessibility, around how we capacitate young people to be the change makers and the ones having these dialogues, and how climate justice and how just transition, how sustainability in the context of the future and in the context of young people can be achieved by getting all of these things done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Utsile. Inclusion of the youth, right? And with that, I'd like to wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much, Utsile. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Tselwe, and thank you, Liko, for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the GCIS. My name is Matshapo Dibidzo from Agape Youth Movement. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.